En algunos países impera la oligarquía con fachada de democracia. ¿Cómo hablar de democracia si dominan las élites y no las mayorías? ¿Cómo hablar de democracia si en los últimos tiempos se ha dado la concentración de la riqueza en pocas manos?
Mexico's leftist president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, is a very brave person because he was invited to the US government's so-called Summit for Democracy, which has nothing to do with democracy. It's a political attempt by the US to unite its allies against China and Russia to wage the new Cold War. And Mexico, as the US southern neighbor, was invited to speak at this summit, and the Mexican president called out the United States for its hypocrisy and said that it's an oligarchy, not a democracy. Now, to be fair, he didn't name the United States directly in these comments, but we have to understand the comments that he made in the context of another speech that he gave just a few weeks before, in which he condemned the United States as an oligarchy. So it was very clear in his comments that AMLO was referring to the United States when he said that it's not actually a democracy, it's an oligarchy. I translated AMLO's full speech at this summit, and I have a full English language transcript over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. I will link to it in the description below. In this speech, he said, "The oligarchy reigns with the facade of democracy." And he said that if we want real democracy, we need greater equality, calling for a separation of economic power and political power.
En nuestro tiempo existe todavía una mezcla de oligarquía y democracia, o una democracia simulada y mediatizada. Es decir, en algunos países impera la oligarquía con fachada de democracia. Por ejemplo, ¿cómo hablar de democracia si dominan las élites y no las mayorías? ¿Cómo hablar de democracia si no existe separación del poder económico y el poder político? ¿Cómo hablar de democracia si en los últimos tiempos se ha dado la concentración de la riqueza en pocas manos más ofensiva en la historia del mundo? La fortuna de una minoría ha aumentado sin límites, sin recato moral alguno, mientras hay 1,000 millones de seres humanos que viven con menos de $1 diario.
The main point of AMLO's speech was essentially that capitalism, this system of extreme inequality with billionaire oligarchs controlling everything, is not democratic. He said, quote, "We must search for greater equality to have more democracy."
Nosotros sostenemos que debemos de ir en la búsqueda de mayor igualdad para tener más democracia, que la democracia sea auténtica, verdadera.
He said many countries have a, quote, "mixture of oligarchy and democracy, or a simulated and mediated democracy." And he said, how can we talk about democracy if there is no separation of economic power and political power? AMLO opened this very powerful speech with a very provocative line. He said, "Many of the great crimes against humanity have been committed in the name of God or in the name of democracy."
Muchos de los grandes crímenes contra la humanidad han sido cometidos en nombre de Dios o en nombre de la democracia. Es importante por ello regresar al significado original y verdadero del concepto de democracia.
That was the opening line of his speech, And it's quite incredible to hear him say that, because when he was speaking, at some moments, they had 9 different videos on screen, because this is a virtual summit. It was all happening virtually via video stream. And you had Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU. You had Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. You had other Western leaders who were looking at him when he was speaking, and he is clearly calling them out. Because everyone knows that when AMLO said that crimes against humanity were committed in the name of democracy, he's referring to the United States, obviously. He's referring to the Iraq War, which was an illegal US invasion to destroy an independent sovereign state and lead to 1 million deaths, and the US did it in the name of democracy. Or Afghanistan, or Libya, or Syria, or Yugoslavia. There are so many examples of these crimes that were committed, and AMLO's clearly calling them out to their face. Now, I mentioned that it's even clearer what the context was if you consider that back on February 28th, AMLO gave a press conference in which he condemned the US State Department for meddling in his government. And he said that the US is not a democracy, it is run by the oligarchy.
¿Qué le digo con todo respeto al señor Blinken del Departamento de Estado? Que hay más democracia actualmente en México que en Estados Unidos. Cuando hablo de que tenemos más democracia nosotros que ellos, es porque aquí gobierna el pueblo, allá gobierna la oligarquía.
So those were the words that he had said just a few weeks before. There is more democracy today in Mexico than in the United States, because here the people govern and there the oligarchy govern. He also criticized the United States, saying it still will not abandon the 2-century-old policy, the Monroe Doctrine, of thinking themselves as the world's government. And he criticized the U.S. for backing an unelected coup regime in Peru.
Aprovecho para contestarle al Departamento de Estado del Gobierno de Estados Unidos que, como es la mala costumbre, siempre se inmiscuyen en asuntos que no les corresponden. Todavía no abandonan la política de hace 2 siglos, la política de Monroe, de sentirse el gobierno del mundo.
Now, AMLO made these remarks at the so-called Summit for Democracy at a time of growing tensions. There are numerous congressmen in the United States, Republicans, who are calling for the U.S. military to invade Mexico in the name of fighting drug cartels. And in response to that, I did a separate video which actually went viral, and I'll link to it in the description below. And AMLO gave this incredible speech, this passionate, leftist nationalist speech at a huge rally in Mexico City, flooded with people, in which he said Mexico is not a U.S. colony or a protectorate. And he said Mexico is an independent and free country. And he also held this rally to honor the anniversary of the Mexican government's nationalization of oil. And he recently nationalized Mexico's lithium reserves, which now belong to the Mexican people.
Pero lo más importante es que desde aquí, desde este zócalo, corazón político y cultural de México, le recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos. Y que podrán amenazarnos con cometer cualquier atropello, pero jamás, jamás permitiremos que violen nuestra soberanía y pisoteen la dignidad de nuestra patria.
Well, AMLO is condemning the hypocrisy of U.S. oligarchs. I should point out that, he is one of the most popular leaders in the entire world, at least among large countries. There's a major US-based polling firm that does regular surveys looking at approval ratings of leaders around the world. And AMLO, since he came in late 2018, has consistently had an approval rating of between 60 and 70%. In December, he had a 72% approval rating, and that's compared to US President Joe Biden, who only has a 41% approval rating and 51% opposition. Canada's Justin Trudeau, only 39% support, 54% opposition. The British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, 34% support, 53% opposition. In France, it's even worse. The neoliberal right-wing banker president, Emmanuel Macron, he has only the approval of around 1/4 of French people, with more than half of the French population opposes him. And there are huge protests going on right now against his neoliberal right-wing economic reforms. So when AMLO says that Mexico is more democratic than the US and the US is an oligarchy, that's not hyperbole. It's not exaggerating. The polls show that it's true. But of course, the so-called US Summit for Democracy has nothing to do with democracy. I am working on another report which will be out, which is about the right-wing authoritarian regimes that were invited to the so-called Summit for Democracy, including the authoritarian leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the authoritarian president of Poland, Duda, the authoritarian leader of India, Narendra Modi, and the pro-fascist leader of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who has praised the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. So obviously this so-called Summit for Democracy is not about democracy. This is an attempt by the United States to bring together allies to build a bloc to wage the new Cold War on China and Russia. China and Russia were not invited, of course, and many of their allies were not invited. US adversaries were not invited, including democracies like Venezuela and Nicaragua, which have democratically elected governments. Instead of inviting them, the US government invited right-wing opposition figures who are, of course, supported by the US, who are from Venezuela and from Nicaragua, although they live in the US. And finally, the most absurd aspect of all is that the United States invited Taiwan, which is not a country. Taiwan is a province of the People's Republic of China. On paper, according to international law, the United States recognizes that fact. When the US normalized relations with Taiwan in 1972, Washington signed 3 communiques starting in 1972. The first communique says very clearly that the US recognizes that Taiwan is part of China, that there's one China, and yet the Biden administration is showing how it supports Taiwanese separatists by inviting them, who are not a country, they do not represent a country, by inviting them to the so-called Summit for Democracy. So it's really the summit of US proxies and allies and client regimes and puppets and running dogs to wage the new Cold War on China and Russia and any independent country that Washington doesn't like and is targeting for regime change. That is why it's very impressive that Mexico's leftist president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, called out the United States to its face, the hypocrisy of the US oligarchy. And again, I always want to stress this point that Mexico is a very important country. There's a lot of racism toward Mexico in the United States, but this is the 10th most populous country on earth. It has a large growing economy. The population is growing as well. Mexico has applied to join the BRICS system. So, this is a very important country, and yet the US treats it as its so-called backyard with this very neo-colonialist mentality. And more leftist leaders in Mexico are not tolerating this neo-colonialist behavior, and they're calling it out, as AMLO did in this speech. So if you want to check it out, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com. I have a link in the description below to the transcript, and I also will link to the other reports I did on AMLO, including the most recent video looking at the amazing rally he gave in which he condemned the Republicans who were threatening to invade Mexico and said that Mexico is not a US colony. With that said, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. If you like the work that we do, please consider going to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support, or you become a patron over at patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. We are completely independent and have no institutional support. So anything that you could provide would really go a long way to help sustain our original journalism and analysis. I want to thank everyone for watching or listening. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.